A grandmaster sits across from an opponent who has just knocked his queen off the board with a smile clearly meant to wound him. The clock is ticking. The room is silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. And instead of flinching, instead of scrambling, the grandmaster leans back, studies the board for 11 full seconds, and makes a move so calm it unsettles everyone watching. He is not indifferent to the loss. He simply refuses to let the loss dictate the next 60 seconds of his life. This is not a story about chess. It is a story about the moment your manager humiliates you in front of your team, the moment your partner says something designed to draw blood, and the moment your body betrays you with a diagnosis you never expected. Most people, in that instant, hand over the controls entirely. They become whatever just happened to them. Their face flushes, their voice shakes, their judgment disappears, and the person who caused the wound gets to watch it land in real time and gets to feel the small, ugly satisfaction of having successfully reached inside another human being and pulled a lever. A rare few remain the grandmasters, untouched, not because nothing touched them, but because they decided, long before that moment ever arrived, exactly how much power the outside world would be allowed to hold over the inside of their minds. This state has a name: emotional untouchability. And contrary to what modern comfort culture insists, it is not the same as numbness, and it is not the same as suppression. It is a discipline, refined over 2,000 years by exiled philosophers, imprisoned emperors, and grieving mothers who buried children and still rose the next morning to teach their students how to keep living with an open hand instead of a clenched fist. It is Stoicism, and it was never intended to be a soft philosophy for peaceful afternoons and quiet gardens. It was built as an ancient weapon for living, forged specifically for the days when life tries to break you in front of an audience that is watching to see whether you'll crack. But there is a danger in wielding this weapon carelessly, and I want to name it before we go any further, because I refuse to hand you half a tool and call it complete. A person can use Stoic discipline to appear calm on the surface while quietly burying everything underneath. And that buried material does not vanish simply because you've stopped acknowledging it. It waits. It accumulates interest, and eventually it either erupts at the worst possible moment, or it hardens into a kind of quiet bitterness that people around you can sense even when you can't name it yourself. This is where the 20th century psychiatrist Carl Jung becomes essential to this conversation. Jung spent his career studying the exact material human beings refuse to look at directly, what he called the shadow, the disowned rage, the denied envy, and the old wound wearing the disguise of a personality trait so convincing that even you have started to believe it was simply who you are. He argued that the parts of ourselves we refuse to integrate don't disappear. They simply operate from behind the scenes, disguised as fate, disguised as bad luck, disguised as other people's cruelty, when in fact they are often our own disowned material finding its way back to the surface. Stoicism teaches you to master your reaction. Jung teaches you to stop lying about what is actually underneath that reaction in the first place. Untouchable, properly understood, does not mean hollow. It does not mean a person who has simply gotten skilled at performing composure while something quietly festers beneath it. It means integrated. A person who is calm because there is genuinely nothing left inside them to hide from. Not a person who is calm because they have become extremely practiced at hiding. 10 lessons are coming. Every single one follows the same exact structure without deviation. First, a true story, historical or psychological, that proves the principle actually holds up under real pressure, rather than existing only in theory. Second, the philosophical anchor you can carry with you permanently. Something small enough to fit in your pocket and sharp enough to matter when you need it. Third, an honest, uncomfortable look at the excuse currently keeping you from using it. Fourth, a specific, concrete action you can begin applying before today ends. This is not content for you to nod along to. This is an instruction for you to actually use. Lesson number 1 is the discipline of the inner citadel. During the Second World War, a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl was stripped of his family, his profession, his possessions, and very nearly his life inside a concentration camp. Guards controlled every visible aspect of his existence: his food, his labor, his movements, his survival, from one hour to the next, with total and absolute authority. And yet Frankl later wrote, in words that have outlived every guard who ever stood over him, that he discovered something those men could never touch: the final human freedom to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances, regardless of how brutal those circumstances became. He watched men around him die not from starvation alone, but from a collapse of inner meaning, and he watched other men survive on almost nothing, because they had found something inside themselves that no uniform, no whip, no wall could reach. Marcus Aurelius described this same fortress nearly 2,000 years earlier, calling it the inner citadel, a mental stronghold that no external force could ever breach unless the person living inside it personally opened the gate and invited the invasion in. He wrote to himself that men seek retreats for themselves in the country, by the sea, or in the mountains, and that this very craving marks a certain unphilosophical mind, because it is fully in a person's power to retreat into their own soul at any moment, in any circumstance, with no travel required at all. Here is your confrontation, and I want you to actually feel the weight of this rather than simply nodding along politely. You currently believe, whether you'd admit it out loud or not, that your peace depends on other people behaving correctly, on your circumstances cooperating, and on the world softening its sharp edges before you are allowed to feel steady inside your own skin. That belief keeps you permanently vulnerable, because you have essentially built a fortress and then removed the front door entirely, leaving it open to anyone who wanders by with bad intentions or even just a bad mood. The tactical application starts today, right now, in this exact moment, if it applies. The next time someone attempts to provoke you, whether through a comment, a tone, or a silence designed to unsettle you, silently name the moment to yourself in these exact words: "This is someone trying to open my gate." That single act of naming instantly restores your position as the gatekeeper of your own mind instead of the powerless victim standing outside it, waiting to see whether the door will hold. Lesson number 2 is the discipline of the pause before reaction. In the 1960s, a group of researchers at Stanford ran what eventually became known as the marshmallow experiment, placing a single treat in front of young children and telling them that if they could wait 15 minutes without eating it, they would earn a second one as a reward for their patience. Decades later, when researchers tracked those same children into adulthood, the ones who had successfully waited showed measurably better outcomes across relationships, careers, financial stability, and emotional regulation than the children who couldn't hold out. The entire advantage, it turned out, came down to a single learnable skill: the ability to insert space between an impulse and an action rather than collapsing the two into one instantaneous reflex. Epictetus built an entire teaching around this exact gap, insisting that between any external event and your response to that event lies a space, however brief, and that inside that narrow space is your only true freedom as a human being. Everything outside that space, the event itself, other people's behavior, the weather, and the market, belongs to fate. Everything inside it belongs entirely to you. Here is the confrontation. You have trained yourself, likely without ever consciously deciding to respond instantly to provocation, treating speed as a form of strength or wit when it is very often the exact opposite. Instant reaction is not confidence dressed in quick thinking. It is frequently a nervous system with no brakes installed, mistaking reflex for resolve. The application is immediate and requires no special equipment. The next time you feel a sharp emotional pull, whether it's the urge to fire back a text, raise your voice, or storm out of a room, count silently to 10 before you speak or type a single word. 10 seconds will not weaken your point if your point was worth making. It will simply remove the version of you that regrets the delivery an hour later. Lesson number 3 is the discipline of confronting the inner critic. Jung worked extensively with patients who described an internal voice that relentlessly criticized every decision they made, every choice, every relationship, every ambition. A voice many of them assumed was simply their conscience keeping them appropriately humble. Jung disagreed sharply with that interpretation. He believed that voice was frequently an internalized parent, teacher, or early wound, speaking fluently in the disguise of wisdom while actually functioning as quiet, persistent sabotage dressed up as good sense. The anchor here is his own observation that until a psychological pattern is made fully conscious, it will continue directing a person's life from the shadows, while that person remains convinced it is simply their own good judgment speaking clearly and reasonably. Here is the confrontation. That harsh internal narrator constantly informing you that you're not disciplined enough, not intelligent enough, and not worthy of the calm you claim to be chasing, is not neutral, objective truth handed down from some impartial court. It is very likely an old recording, inherited decades ago from a specific voice in your early life, playing on a loop you never once thought to question, because it arrived so early in your development that it felt indistinguishable from your own personality. The application tonight is simple, but revealing. The next time that voice speaks up inside you, ask it directly, out loud if the room allows for it, whose voice this is. Originally, you may be genuinely startled by the answer that surfaces, and that startle is exactly the beginning of taking your authority back. Lesson number 4 is the discipline of separating events from judgments. Epictetus, once enslaved before eventually becoming one of the most respected teachers in Rome, endured a broken leg inflicted deliberately by his own master, and reportedly remained composed enough throughout the ordeal to calmly warn the man that continued force would break the bone entirely, which it eventually did. All without Epictetus raising his voice even once, or begging for mercy he knew would not come. His core teaching, preserved by his students, states plainly that people are disturbed not by events themselves, but by their own opinions and judgments about those events. The event is neutral. The suffering is added afterward, by the mind, almost always, without the mind's own awareness that it did so. Here is the confrontation. You currently treat your interpretation of an event as identical to the event itself. So when someone cancels plans with you, you experience it internally as rejection rather than simply as a cancellation. And that extra layer of meaning, entirely manufactured by your own mind in the space of a second, becomes the actual source of your suffering, not the cancellation itself. The application today is to catch yourself mid-story, in real time, if you can manage it. The next time you feel wounded by something someone said or did, ask yourself plainly what actually happened, in strictly factual terms, completely separate from the interpretation you immediately and automatically attach to it. Lesson number 5 is the discipline of memento mori. Roman generals returning victorious from war were followed through the cheering streets by a servant, whose sole appointed task was to walk directly behind them, whispering into their ear, again and again, "Remember you will die," even as the crowd around them shouted their name and treated them, for one single afternoon, as something close to a god. Marcus Aurelius carried this awareness with him daily, writing that a person who genuinely remembers their own mortality lives with a clarity and urgency simply unavailable to those who quietly assume they have unlimited time remaining to get things right. Here is the confrontation. You are avoiding the conversation, the apology, the risk, and the honest word you actually mean, because some quiet, comfortable part of you assumes there will always be another chance later, another Tuesday, another opening. That assumption is the primary reason so many people reach the final years of their life, having said almost nothing they actually meant to the people who mattered most. The application tonight is direct and requires no elaborate planning. Name the one delayed conversation currently sitting heavily in your chest, and schedule it for this coming week, not for some vague someday that conveniently never actually arrives. Let's pause here for a moment, because I want to interrupt the momentum of this video entirely on purpose. You have been listening for several minutes now, and I genuinely want you to notice whether you are actually present in this moment, or simply letting this play in the background while your attention quietly drifts toward something else entirely, like a notification, a task list, or a half-formed thought about dinner. 5 more lessons remain ahead of us, and I promise you they are not lighter or easier than what you've already heard. If anything, they cut closer. So put down whatever object is currently in your hand. Sit up straight if you've slouched on the couch without noticing. Passive listening changes absolutely nothing about the actual shape of your life. Only applied attention does that work. Take one real, full breath right now, and let's continue together with your complete presence this time, not half of it. Lesson number 6 is the discipline of Amor Fati. Nietzsche, a man who lived most of his adult life in genuine physical agony and profound social isolation, rejected by the academic world he had once belonged to, did not simply teach quiet endurance as the ceiling of what a person could achieve. He demanded something far more radical of himself and of anyone willing to listen, that a person learn to actually love their entire fate exactly as it unfolded, refusing to edit out a single chapter, including the ones that nearly destroyed him. Here is the confrontation. You still resent a specific chapter of your own history, whether it's a failed relationship, a public failure, or a wound inflicted in childhood that was never your fault to begin with, and some part of you has quietly constructed an identity around being the person that thing happened to. This keeps you permanently cast, without your full awareness, as a character trapped inside a scene that ended long ago, but never got the memo. The application tonight is to write one honest paragraph naming precisely what strength, skill, or clarity that exact wound eventually gave you, without pretending for a single sentence that you enjoyed receiving it in the first place. Lesson number 7 is the discipline of the view from above. Marcus Aurelius regularly imagined himself observing the entire earth from a vast, impossible distance, watching armies and empires shrink down to near insignificance against the sheer scale of time itself, a mental practice that modern psychology now recognizes and studies under the clinical name decentering. Here is the confrontation. The thing currently consuming your mind at 3 in the morning, replaying itself uninvited on a loop you can't seem to switch off, feels enormous to you only because you are standing 2 inches away from it. You have not once, in the entire span of the last month, actually measured it honestly against the true, full length of your one life. The application is physical and can be done anywhere. Imagine the camera pulling steadily back, from your room, to your street, to the curve of the earth itself, holding that image deliberately for 10 full seconds before returning your attention to the original thought, which will have noticeably shrunk in the process. Lesson number 8 is the discipline of individuation. Jung believed that genuine psychological wholeness comes not from eliminating your flaws or hiding them more skillfully, but from consciously owning every fragment of yourself, the noble and the shameful alike, instead of performing a slightly different mask for every room you happen to walk into. Here is the confrontation. You are very likely exhausted from the invisible labor of maintaining several separate versions of yourself for different audiences, And somewhere along the way, without quite noticing the moment it happened, you have started to lose track of which version, if any of them, is actually true. The application this week is to say one honest, slightly unguarded sentence to someone who has, until now, only ever met your carefully performed self. Lesson number 9 is the discipline of voluntary discomfort. Seneca, despite possessing enormous wealth and access to every imaginable comfort, deliberately practiced poverty for several days each month, sleeping on a hard floor and eating only plain, coarse food, specifically to prove to himself, through direct bodily experience rather than mere theory, that losing comfort would not actually destroy him. Here is the confrontation. You avoid discomfort so thoroughly and so habitually that your nervous system has genuinely never learned it can survive minor hardship intact, which means ordinary inconveniences, a delayed train, a cold room, or an unanswered message now register internally as full-blown threats rather than the trivial disruptions they actually are. The application this week is one deliberate discomfort, chosen consciously and on purpose, not as punishment inflicted on yourself, but as proof offered directly to your own nervous system. Lesson number 10 is the discipline of the evening reckoning. Seneca closed every single day of his life by asking himself 3 unchanging questions before sleep. What weakness did I overcome today? What fault did I correct in myself? In what specific way am I better tonight than I was this morning? Here is the final confrontation, and it applies to everything you've absorbed across this entire video. Insight without a nightly reckoning simply evaporates by morning, leaving no trace behind it. You can absorb every single idea in this script and remain, in practical terms, exactly who you were yesterday if you never once measure any of it against your actual behavior in the world. The application. Tonight and every night, going forward, without exception, is to ask yourself those exact 3 questions before sleep, keeping each answer to a single honest sentence. You now carry 10 disciplines refined by philosophers, prisoners, and psychiatrists who faced conditions considerably harder than most of what you will personally face today. None of them require money. None of them require permission from anyone else. What they require is repetition, quiet and unglamorous, the kind nobody applauds, practiced on ordinary days that build, slowly and invisibly, into the kind of person nothing can easily reach. Choose one. Choose the lesson that made you flinch slightly while you were listening, because that flinch was never discomfort for its own sake. It was recognition. It was the part of you that already knows exactly where you've been hiding. Start there tonight, and if this reached something real in you, write that single practice down somewhere you will actually see it tomorrow morning, and subscribe to this channel, because the next video goes further into the exact territory most people remain far too comfortable to ever enter on their own. Untouchable was never about feeling nothing. It was always about choosing, deliberately and with open eyes, what gets to reach you at all. Grandmaster Calm, 10 Stoic lessons for becoming emotionally unbreakable fortress of the mind. 10 ancient practices to stop anyone from controlling you, shadow and steal. How Jung and the Stoics built an untouchable person's silence is power. 10 Stoic habits that make you impossible to rattle untouchable by design. 10 ancient lessons for total emotional mastery.